This CBS News special report is part of our continuing coverage of the crisis in the Kremlin. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
Good day again. Communist hardliners with tanks in the streets have deposed Mikhail Gorbachev. In the wake of that, President Bush, this is a live picture you're seeing from Washington, D.C., has returned from his vacation home in Kennebunkport, Maine. The White House spokesman said earlier the president would be going back to Maine tomorrow. About that, we'll have to wait and see. On his left, Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Council advisor, and moving into the frame, John Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire, who is, of course, the chief of White House staff. So the president, without saying anything, disappears into one of the doors on the south lawn of the White House. There is Wyatt Andrews. Wyatt?
Dan, the president has returned to the White House today and has convened all of his top advisors. Many of them, Secretary Cheney, for example, was in British Columbia fishing. Secretary of State Baker in Wyoming, all of them are being called back for meetings that we don't really know when they'll be held, but probably late tonight or early tomorrow morning. It's clear because of all that the U.S. policy toward this coup is in some state of formation, basically because many officials, including the president himself, are hoping that the coup will be reversed. They certainly don't see it as something right now that will stand up forever. They're hoping that Yeltsin will succeed in his defiance. Because of that, all of the policy statements that have been made so far, both by the president and by his national security advisor, are to hope that Yeltsin succeeds, hope that people obey Yeltsin's call for civil disobedience, but not to go much beyond that, Dan, because they're afraid of goading anything that would make the United States look like it appears, at least to support a civil insurrection or civil war. There has been, Dan, the first communication from the new Soviet government to the United States. It came earlier today in Washington when the Soviet ambassador, Viktor Kompletkov, was summoned to the State Department. He told Assistant Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger that the new government, quote unquote, wants political and economic reforms to continue and wants to develop good relations with the United States. Note, though, there was an absence of any note of defiance toward the new Soviet government from the Soviet ambassador. Finally, Dan, the president is in town ostensibly to attend tomorrow morning the 10 o'clock swearing in of the new ambassador to the Soviet Union, Robert Strauss. All of which is interesting because despite the president's claim that he does not want to do business as usual yet with this new Soviet government, officials here have not yet reversed Strauss's posting to Moscow. Dan?
Wyatt, Brent Scowcroft spoke on Air Force One as the president was coming down from Kennebunkport. What do we know about that? What did he say? Did he shed new light?
He said that the United States viewed the reaction here, the coup, as negatively. It's important to note that the United States is not buying Soviet claims that Gorbachev is sick or ill and that they are in the process of instituting more perestroika on their own terms. The United States sees this as a setback. And as I said, Dan, they are here to sort of reformulate a United States policy that, again, supports Yeltsin without going overboard into any sort of harsh rhetoric.
Wyatt Andrews at the White House, where President Bush, as you saw in our live pictures just a few moments ago, has arrived back to consult with his advisors. A lot of talk around Washington about this being a massive failure, quote unquote, of U.S. intelligence, not to anticipate what could happen here in August with Gorbachev on vacation. No doubt there'll be a lot of talk about that around the country as the days go on. From the intelligence agencies, and not just the CIA standpoint, their basic story is that these things are very difficult to protect, and they've done the best that they could. Developments are Vice President Gennady Yanayev has taken power from President Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. This is an out-and-out coup. Gorbachev was on vacation, and Yanayev has said that Gorbachev is undergoing treatment and might someday return to power, said the leader of the new hard-right communist coup. Now, a member of Boris Yeltsin's staff has been quoted as saying within the last hour that remember, Yeltsin is a sometime ally of Gorbachev on the main principal points about democratizing the Soviet Union. He was always an ally, but Yeltsin, who's basically on the same side as Gorbachev, is now the hope, as Wyatt Andrews outlined. A member of Yeltsin's staff said that they had satisfied themselves that Gorbachev was alive. There was a talk of a conversation with at least a member of Yeltsin's staff with Gorbachev. So if you're looking for some ray of good news in what has basically been, over the last 20 hours or so, a lot of disturbing news out of the Soviet Union. It is that Gorbachev is apparently alive. Now, Boris Yeltsin has called on those in the Russian Republic, which he rules as the elected leader, to resist. There have been signs of resistance. Hundreds of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and other vehicles moved into Moscow. Some citizens, an extraordinary CBS News exclusive tape taken at the scene, were trying to stop the tanks as they moved in. Watch this. And the tank rolls on. There were a number of these scenes around Moscow. We have photographs which we may show you later, videotape, which will certainly be showing on the evening news. Soldiers talking to citizens saying, listen, we'll show you, we take our bullets out of our weapons, but in effect saying, don't make any major move on us. In some cases, using megaphones, soldiers trying to get citizens to disperse. That's the situation in Moscow. Not very much known about what the situation may or may not be in other parts of the country. Now, President Bush has called the coup, quote, a disturbing development, unquote, and he questioned whether the Soviet people would surrender their newfound freedoms. Question in the face of a combined effort by the Soviet military, the KGB, the industrial military complex, and the party apparatus, what the dissidents can do. Now let's go to Jonathan Sanders, our CBS News correspondent in Moscow, live up from our bureau. Jonathan, the situation on Soviet television and Russian television, what are the Russian people being told?
Dan, Russian television, the television of the Russian Republic under President Boris Yeltsin, was not on the air tonight. Russian television uses the facilities controlled by the Kremlin, and it simply did not appear. The Soviet television news, Vremya, the official voice of the establishment, came on with a very dry announcement saying that Mr. Yanayev was taking over under Article 127 of the Soviet Constitution, that this was a legal and perfectly normal way of having a change of government in the Soviet Union. There was no mention of the kinds of footage that we have seen, actions in the streets of Moscow. They read the long decrees of Yanayev and the special emergency committee that has taken control of the Soviet Union. So far, they have showed no footage of other parts of the Soviet Union. We have no reports from the Soviet media as to what is going on in the vast heartland of Russia, across Soviet Central Asia. We do know that troops are on the move in the Soviet Baltic republics. In Moscow itself, of course, there was the tremendous scene outside the Russian parliament today, with men and women building makeshift barricades, in a way taking the lesson that they had learned from television here in the Soviet Union, the lessons shown on Russian television from earlier this year when people built barricades in Vilnius, Lithuania, to protect their parliament. They're doing the same thing to protect the parliament building where Boris Yeltsin, the great hope for democracy in the Soviet Union, is still trying to salvage what he says is the reforms that was started by Mikhail Gorbachev. Dan?
John, I think it's important for us to remind our viewers and listeners that those photographs were taken today in Moscow of the citizens, sort of heartrending in a way to see them trying to put up what barricades they could to stop tanks and armored personnel carriers, but those barricades would not stand up a minute. The tanks and the armored personnel carriers continued to roll. Now, a Soviet military official announced that he was assuming control of three secessionist Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And according to a report from Australian Associated Press, they quote, Commander Lieutenant Theodore Kuzmin has spoken by telephone with the Latvian president, who described Soviet paratroopers landing in Estonia, and the president of Estonia heard from the military commander that he was taking complete charge there. In the Baltic states, the Soviet military is making its big move, trying to close the window of the Baltic states, trying to break away from the Soviet Union. The stock market in the United States down at last report just over 61 points. It had been down over 100 points as the day started. In Tokyo, the Tokyo Exchange closed, having lost almost 6% of its total value in the first day's trading after the announcement that Gorbachev was out. We want to go to our hurricane coverage now in just a moment, but very quickly, Stephen Cohen, our Princeton University professor and CBS News consultant. Steve, the keys to watch now are, besides what happens in the Ukraine and Georgia, what?
Well, we have to assume, because this looks like a classic coup, that all across the country, tanks, the agents of the coup, are fanning out to close down the strongholds of democracy, newspapers, radio stations, parliaments across the country. Clearly, the political hope at the moment is Boris Yeltsin, the elected official of the largest republic. Russia is the center. If he can hold on, there's hope for real resistance. If he can't, the resistance in the center, at least, is probably over.
And one of the keys for President Bush is, does the new coup leadership say that it will abide by these agreements Gorbachev has made, such as the conventional force reduction in Europe and the missile reductions that Gorbachev has committed them to?
They will probably abide by that. Whether the strategic arms agreement will be ratified by our Senate is another question. But bear in mind one thing. These people have their own foreign policy. It's not the same foreign policy that Gorbachev pursued toward the West. These people have been very explicit about their resentments against Gorbachev's foreign policy. They consider it not to be in Soviet national interest. It will not be the same foreign policy in the future if these people who staged this coup stay in power.
Now, thank you, Steve Cohen, as part of our live CBS News report covering two major stories, Gorbachev ousted in the Soviet Union and a big, dangerous hurricane beginning to move inland now in the northeastern part of the United States. Hurricane Bob is bearing down on New England, specifically Rhode Island, Massachusetts, very much in its path. At last report, portions of the main hurricane were beginning to move inland in the Rhode Island area with estimated winds of 100 miles an hour as it moved inland. Now, the top winds of this hurricane, 115 miles an hour, were the steadily since last night. This is the top velocity of the winds, with gusts in the 138 to 140 mile an hour range. And you say, well, as it moves inland, why is it only 100 miles an hour? Because the main force of this hurricane is in the northeastern quadrant of the hurricane, as it usually is in this part of the world. And that means that the upper part of the counterclockwise turning hurricane is likely to hit hardest in the Massachusetts area, Cape Cod, Nantucket, Hyannisport, directly in its path. Let's go to Harold Dow, CBS News correspondent, who's in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Harold?
Okay, Dan, the experts said that Hurricane Bob would arrive in the Cape at about 2 o'clock this afternoon, and I'm here to tell you that Hurricane Bob arrived on time with furious winds and heavy rains. Boats are being blown around in the Cape. Earlier, there was a large traffic jam on both the roads leading out of the Cape, and we now understand that the bridges have been closed. Officials said they would close the bridges if the winds had reached in excess of 70 miles an hour, and you could be assured that they've already reached that level. Now, a tree just blew down just a short while ago and landed on top of a house, and we find that anything that's not nailed down is actually airborne at this moment, and the water is rising out on the Cape, as I said earlier. Schools have been closed, businesses have sent their employees home, and everyone has been asked to go to high ground. Both the state of Rhode Island and Massachusetts declared state of emergencies, ordering all residents to leave the area and evacuate, and those that remain here are told to stay inside their homes. Again, everything is blowing around outside. It's almost looks like a sandstorm, but it's rain and water, and it's very hazy. You can't see a thing, and I have a feeling that the worst is yet to come.
Well, Bob Sheets, our friend who heads the National Hurricane Center in Miami, would underscore that, Harold, that here's the situation in the hurricane. The main force of the hurricane has passed the outer reaches of New York's Long Island. There's considerable damage there, and a full hurricane warning remains in effect from Rhode Island all the way up to Maine. And in terms particularly of rising water, flash flooding, very high tides, so-called sea surge, rising water, perhaps the major danger, the worst may be yet to come for the area roughly Rhode Island through Massachusetts and on up to Maine. Stay tuned to this CBS station for the very latest on what's happening inside the Soviet Union and on what's happening with the dangerous hurricane as it begins to move inland. Dan Rather, CBS News, New York. I'll see you along the way.
Crisis in the Kremlin has been a CBS News special report.